My guest today is Rikk Watts. It's good to have you, Rikk, on the programme. Rikk is well known in the realm of Christian theology in Australia, but has a long career prior to that, unpicking some of the deeper truths of the Bible, but there's much more to the story. Welcome, Rikk. Nice to have you.
Lovely to be here.
Let's start at the beginning. You were a drummer. Let's really start with the important things. You're trained as an aeronautical engineer and you used to work at IBM. So how does somebody with that kind of background end up doing theology?
Oh my goodness. Well, how does one answer that? I think basically what happened was I enjoyed technology, but what drives technology and what it should be serving are people. And learning about people became much more of an interest to me, and that led to doing some studies in philosophy and art history, sociology. And through that, working with a crisis accommodation group, John Smith, the God Squad, remember them? Yep. In that role, I realised I probably needed to know what I was talking about. It would help. And then that led to study for the first time in biblical studies, theology at Gordon Conwell in Boston, and then Cambridge after that.
I like the link you've made between a different kind of academic world into theology. You were at Boston, you were at Cambridge, and you did, I think, philosophy, history and theology. Are they all connected in the way you think?
Well, this is a really interesting question, and I think some of the problems we face as Christians today go back to the world in which the gospel first began to take root. So very quickly, in the Greek world, there were two ways of knowing. One was through abstract rational ideas. They will call that philosophy. Theology is a part of that. So it's the rational science of the divine. And it's all about speculation and what makes sense. That's not what you see in the scriptures. The scriptures are much more concerned about experience and history. So if you want to know who Yahweh is, and if you want to know who Jesus is, you get four gospels, their history, they're encountering the person of Jesus. So for me, thinking as a Christian requires you really to think more historically in one sense rather than abstract philosophical terms, if that makes any sense to you.
Now, you were at Regent College in Canada.
That's right, yeah.
For 20 years, were you there?
Yep.
And how important was that time for you?
Oh, my goodness, it's really shaped me in profound ways. A couple of things stood out. Initially, it was a school for lay people. So it has brethren roots. And if you know the brethren, they're a little suspicious of what they would call professional ministry. Because of those lay roots, the people it was serving were folks who were either doctors or lawyers or housewives, engineers, who are coming out of a very practical and engaged world.
Again, that connection's there in your
There
mind.
it is again, right? And the idea is the gospel really is meant to impact the world. So part of the danger is we can see the gospel as something that takes us out of the world, in which case I think we'll always have a bit of an issue as to how we relate to this world, if it's all going to burn up. Whereas if it's actually about changing this world, then there's a deeper level of integration. And I think that's what I got from Regent. Actually.
And you've worked across many educational institutions and as an instructor and mentor to many. What do you try to impart to your students?
Well, this, at the risk of sounding terribly pious, at the core of what we believe is the person Jesus. And it's so easy for him to become a set of ideas or an icon for something else. So what I keep telling them is that they need to come to know him as a person. Right? That's absolutely central to everything. Central
to what we believe and how we understand life.
And who we are. It's all relational, right?
It's not just a knowledge of the Bible, but the way that the Bible and faith and Jesus interacts with you.
Yeah. Well, I think the striking thing about the God of Israel and the Jesus who we meet is Yahweh's not a human being, clearly not, but a person. And the only way you know persons is through their story. I think that's why the Bible has lots of narrative in it, right? I learn about you by asking you about your past, what you like, right? The Gospels are doing that. So when they're telling the story of Jesus, this is not a way for common people to get to know God that we can learn about in a more sophisticated way. No, truth is ultimately personal. So it is primarily about relationship.
Truth interrogates you, doesn't it, in a way, about who you are and what you are.
But it's the person who's speaking the truth. So it's not just I'm hearing some word coming out of the vacuum of space. I'm looking to the face of this first century Jewish person who asked me a question in a context. Right? So it's deeply historical, deeply personal. And it's this relational dynamic that can easily get lost.
And he still thrills you and challenges you.
He's extraordinary. No one like him. really. I'm obsessed.
Yes, and that's fine, as long as it then spells itself out in the specifics, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah. But you made a link, didn't you, when we were talking, between your past world and the present world. What essentially was that link?
Well, I trained as an engineer, and I realised behind engineering are human beings. Human beings create engineering, or they do it for the sake of other people. So that led to the question of what it meant to be human, and I think that's where the Christian answer most fully gives us a sense of who we are. And you mentioned hope, meaning, purpose, things like that. So.
Yeah, somebody's overhearing our conversation today, and they're saying, how is it and why is it that the Christian gospel should have some impact upon me? How would you unpack that as a Christian academic?
Well, the first thing I say is you can't live in the modern world without having a basically Christian worldview. I've taught in a very large Asian country.
Tell me why. I don't understand.
I'm going to tell you right now. So I taught many years in a very large Asian country, who shall remain nameless, at some of the universities. And we were there because they recognised that the West wouldn't become the West without what they called our religion. So I would teach on this, and at the end of the week, I'd say to these students, all right, now you know your past, and you know a particular dynasty, and you know your modern country. You've heard about the worldview the Bible has. Tell me now, which does your modern country most resemble? That old dynasty or the biblical worldview? And the stunned responses when they realised change is a good thing, it could actually happen. That the way you learn about the world is actually through the senses and testing, that cities are dynamic and change, right? Everybody has equal value regardless of their gender, their social status, ethnicity, that love and compassion really matter, the body's not the enemy. Those key ideas are all uniquely Christian.
Many people would say, really, that the Christian community is very much against change, wouldn't they? And that's a terrible thing to say in the light of what you've just said.
It's a terrible misunderstanding. Yeah, absolutely. So you'll notice how Genesis begins. It doesn't begin with a perfect creation. That is an astonishing turning point. It says creation is good. If the world's perfect, it can't change, and you can't do anything to change it. Who want to live in that world? That's a prison. But by making the world good, it gives room for human agency. We can do things. So Paul is the first person in antiquity to talk about transformation as a path to hope, which is what you were speaking about.
Yeah, sure. And for you, the person of Jesus Christ is central to all this thinking.
Absolutely.
And do you think we've lost our way in some Christian thinking about that?
I think we have. I think because human beings crave certainty, we've been seduced into thinking that if we have a nice rational model, things will work. But, you know, I'm married. If you've been in a marriage, you know that it's not rational in that sense. It's much more relational. And that's what the biblical narrative gives us. It gives us ways to actually develop a relationship. So if we lose that, it's possible to actually go to a seminary and come out knowing all kinds of theology, but not really know the person of Jesus. And I don't mean that in a trite way. I mean in a really deep way of engaging with him.
So. And did you find in your teaching career that you discovered and rediscovered this time and time again?
Oh, yes. One of my favourite classes is Introduction to the New Testament. And I tell my students I love to teach this because it reminds me of what I believe and why I believe it. And it's a wonderful thing to do, just to focus back on him.
And sometimes God says, don't forget why and what it is that you're about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, look, thanks for sharing with us. What do you see the greatest challenge, just in a sentence, the greatest challenge of our Christian mission today is?
I think regaining confidence in Scripture. And by that I mean really understanding what Scripture has to say. I think it's become too narrow, and I think people are not quite sure they can trust it anymore. And I want to say you really can. It's an astonishing collection.
Well, this isn't like learning by rote. This is something that's much more profound and deep than that.
Changing the way you think about the world. It's very powerful.
Rikk, thanks for having this conversation. It's been good today to talk together.